Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Lucy Dunn and today I'm joined by Nikki Costa, who is the former Director of Legislative Affairs at Number 10, and Kathleen Stock, the contributing editor at Unheard. Last Friday, a vote was passed in the House of Commons, where MPs voted in favour of assisted dying by a narrow majority of 23 votes. Now the bill will move into the House of Lords, where it will be scrutinised further as it makes its way through Parliament. Nikki, you've been a vocal opponent of this bill. How did you feel on Friday when you heard the result of the vote?
Extremely sad that we have made this decision, or that a Prime Minister, honouring a personal promise, has pushed through such societal changing legislation without having done the work, without any of the policy making process, and that the Commons has descended to the level where the objections of the Royal College of Physicians and the Royal College of Psychiatrists were waved away by the sponsors. We all have different views. That for me is a real indictment on the Commons.
And Kathleen, you're in the process of writing a book, I think it's out next year if I'm correct, about the case against assisted dying. Without any spoilers, can you kind of set out that case for us?
Well, it's a case against assisted dying as it is found in the contemporary world. So it's not about hypothetical imaginary systems in which we can get things absolutely right. It's about the systems we have. It's about assisted death. I prefer to say death because it's not about dying, it's actually about killing. But it's at scale. It's delivered through a health service with all of the problems that brings for the conception of medicine, because of course you have to change the conception of medicine radically. You're no longer improving health, you are also destroying health under the same banner. That's just one massive sea change that will result from this. What I try and argue in this book is just go through all the consequences that this will have in a way that is being not addressed by the people that are pushing it through right now at all.
Yeah, I suppose on that note, you sort of talk about, for example, as you just said there, that changing medicine, and I think, particularly looking at the sort of Hippocratic oath that doctors swear about first do no harm, it's quite a cultural shift in many ways people will have to get their heads around. How do you foresee that, going forward?
Well, as I say in the book, we want our health professionals to have a very low tolerance for inducing death. It's something that we hope, so that at the very least this is going to change the relationship of many people to the health service. It's all very well people like Kim Ledbetter telling us that this is a discrete activity that can just simply be folded in at the right time, but it is not going to be received like that. So even if you just took that time, it's quite a big consequence, but that alone, before we start talking about coercion or anorexia or all of those issues, we just take that alone, people will stop going to see their GPs because they will become frightened that they are going to be funneled into a process they can't get out of. Not all of us feel on top of our, relationships with doctors. And of course, there will be doctors who will become absolute specialists in this area, as we've seen in Canada, who are highly enthusiastic about it, who think of it as they have a very simplistic philosophical attitude towards it, which is just, I am merely the instrument for this person's will, and if they autonomously want to die right now, who am I to say that they shouldn't? Now that's philosophically all confused. Autonomy does not get you there, does not get you a right to assistance from somebody else, but it doesn't matter because they'll be there and they'll be they won't be doing anything illegal.
Yeah, Nikki, I suppose picking up on what Kathleen's just said there's been a lot of criticism levied towards the bill because of amendments not being heard and certain MPs preparing statements to be read in the House of Commons and then not being able to voice their own concerns about the issue. From your point of view, what are some of the main issues that just have not been fully dived into?
Just to first of all pick up on what Kathleen said, this is such a seismic change to our NHS, to our society, and spell it out. For every terminally ill person, you lose the default of support to the very end. You have to justify, whether to yourself or to other people, why you didn't choose the option to end your life. You have to deal with the consequences of saying, I know I may be a burden. I know I may be really weighing my family down, but I don't want to end my life. That is a fundamental change. And what we've done in this instance is The government, and it is in this way a government bill, has, because it has been passed on the back of Labour votes, and we know where the Prime Minister is, has said, even though we want this change to be made, we won't do the work. If you go back to the 1967 Abortion Act, there was the Peel Committee that was established by the President of the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and the medical profession was consulted beforehand. How do we approach this if we're going to get it right? And that led to the bill that was introduced to Parliament, and then in many ways we saw then a consensus and a settled legislation until just last week. You similarly see with the Human Embryology and Fertilisation Act, the Warnock Commission, again, detailed work beforehand. And I understand that the 2024 intake of MPs, they don't actually know what the difference is between consultation and a poll. And I'm going to spell it out. Consultation allows you to go into the detail of the provisions and say, how will this work? So we'll be able to turn around to the psychiatrist and say, what does this mean for suicide prevention? What does this mean when you're dealing with a patient in distress? Should the answer be when somebody's in distress to get them straight into the system and the assessment? Does there need to be a pause? That's completely devoid. So you might be asking the doctors, it is your right to raise this, which is in the legislation, your right to raise this with any patient, no matter how vulnerable. Is that being driven by the legal risk, as the BMA seems to imply, that unless you have that right, you're not covered? Or is it driven actually by what's in the patient's best interest? All these things would be thrashed out, but we haven't had that. So instead, we've just had the legislative process. And the Institute for Government has said, this is a deeply irresponsible way to do this, because you're trying to do with the legislative process what should be done in a different area. So then you've got the situation of committee stage, all very much owned by the sponsor. The sponsor chose the witnesses. They were biased towards a particular view. We didn't hear any negative views from jurisdictions which have assisted dying or assisted suicide. You then saw that the amendments, because the committee strength was so strong in favour of the bill, amendment after amendment voted down, whether it's to protect those from anorexia, those with terminal illnesses, to increase the protection for those with from coercion, to protect those with Down syndrome. The list goes on. Hundreds of amendments just rejected because they were seen as impediments to getting there. And then report stage. Sorry, forgive me, I'm going on, but at report stage can never compensate for committee stage, where you do line by line. Report stage is where you get a selection of issues debated and a selection voted on. So of the 130 odd amendments, I think it's about 150, 120 just didn't get debated and didn't get decisions. And those were all the issues that were still outstanding. And you get this very curated, report stage couldn't patch it. And of the few things that were allowed to be voted on, they were just voted down, with the exception of the one, which is that you shouldn't raise ending a child's life, that you shouldn't raise this with under 18s. So we've got a situation for the Lords where they're picking up a bill which hasn't really got the strength it needs to change society. And that's where the Lords have to come in.
And we'll come to the Lords in a second. I suppose, Kathleen, just thinking about what you'd said about, euthanasia being legal in other countries, for example, Canada. I mean, what I thought was quite interesting was many of the opponents of the bill had brought up the fact that instead of looking at assisted dying to help people who are at the end of their lives and in a lot of pain and suffering, perhaps there should be more research and funding put into how to better improve palliative care in our country. Do you worry that if this bill does receive royal assent, passes into law, that in many ways that palliative care in our country, there's less of an incentive to better the standard of that?
Yes, and there's evidence to back it up, because there's evidence that where assisted dying is introduced into a healthcare system, palliative care develops 3 times slower than relative to systems where it isn't. And that makes sense because in most healthcare systems, there is limited resources, and palliative care is not massively expensive, but it's more expensive than ending someone's life. And you're going to take doctors out of one of those options and put them in another. So they'll be competing directly. And if you look at previous examples like the Liverpool care pathway, a notorious withdrawal of treatment protocol that was brought in, with compassionate branding and no doubt intentions behind it, because nobody wants to carry on using medical treatment where it beyond the point at which it's doing any good. But it became absolutely rigidly operationalized, and it started to save trusts money. And in fact, they were ended up being incentivized to put people on this kind of withdrawal of food and water. And there was devastating consequences. So that's a good example of what can happen in these sort of massive systems with relatively blind impersonal protocols being operated by stressed professionals where responsibility is stretched across lots of different people. So you can always tell yourself that, oh, someone else will pick this up. Somebody has already agreed on it. And you can see in Canada, when you look at like coroner's reports, for instance, coming out of Ontario, it's all about, this person said no, this person said yes, and then they found another person to say yes. And so that person could tell themselves, well, somebody else said yes. Yeah, but somebody else said no. So it's just all of the problems of dealing in multidisciplinary teams when there's stretched resources are going to be even worse when it comes to this.
Yeah, I think, Nikki, looking forward in terms of where we are just now, you mentioned the House of Lords before, the bill is now there. I mean, what happens next? And is the fight to kill the bill still alive?
What do people mean by kill the bill? It's about saying, not this bill. This bill is not, if you are minded to do this change, you do it well, and you don't do it with this bill on such infirm foundations. Because who's going to take responsibility when the things go wrong? Those MPs that have crossed this line and say, in order that some will have this choice, there will be some that will die who shouldn't. That is a natural equation. No system is 100% safe. But their moral duty in the Lords and in the Commons was to ensure that number was the minimum possible to allow other people that choice. That for me is the equation. And so the Lords must wrestle with that. Is this bill up to scratch? And we know that second reading will be now on the 12th of September. That's what's in the public domain. I think, or certainly, it's been widely reported by the journalists. It's not been announced as business yet, but 12th of September for second reading. There are minimum intervals in the Lords, so then the committee stage cannot start until 2 weeks later. Committee stage is of the whole House. So we won't see the control that we saw exerted in the Commons by the sponsor. Every peer is allowed to speak to the amendments. Every peer may table amendments. There aren't votes at committee stage. It's an exploratory stage to extract answers from the sponsor, to extract answers from the government, to test where the will of the House is on particular issues. And that's going to be extensive. Typically, the Lords will take 1.5 times the time that the Commons took in committee stage. These are the rules of thumb for any bill that you would go through. So, if we took, I think it was February, March, February, March. So let's say 2 months, and you would expect at least 3 months in committee for the Lords. Now that's sorry, I should have done it in days, but multiple days. You're looking at a long, and then report stage is a more substantive stage in the Lords. Again, every amendment can be debated, it can be both debated and voted on. There are no time limits, and peers are allowed to, the only way to silence a peer is to say that the noble Lord may no longer be heard, and then you have a vote on it. But people will self-regulate because they'll want to get to answers. So I don't think what you're going to see is about killing the bill. I think it's about really grinding down on the detail, and I think the Lords will give short shrift to the sort of the cavalier attitude in the Commons, and they've been pretty annoyed anyway about cavalier attitudes to the Commons to legislation. But on this particularly, I would expect that to come to the fore.
I've seen some peers, talk on, for example, different, radio programmes in recent days, I suppose, talking about potentially not voting down this bit of legislation because it did receive a majority in the House of Commons. I mean, if it were to get voted down, if there were to be significant amendments made, is that unprecedented for a private member's bill in the Lords?
No, it's not unprecedented, and I believe the peer you're referring to is Lord Falconer, who is the sponsor for this bill in the Lords, has himself, I think, taken through at least 5 attempts to change the legislation. And he himself has voted against government bills, government manifesto bills, at second reading and opposed them. So it's a little bit of, changing his tune according to his particular objectives. If the Lords was not allowed to reject a bill, they wouldn't have second reading or third reading, a vote on the bill as a whole. They'll just do committee stage and report stage. There is a Salisbury Convention, which is about manifesto pledges. This is not in the manifesto. It's been no party's manifesto. It's a private member's bill. It's not even a government bill. So it has none of the protections. And this attempt to sort of reframe our constitution is wrong. It is a house that has entitled to have its view. The Parliament Acts exist. Should there become a duel between the two houses, and it says your power is only to delay, and we can ultimately overrule you. But that is the conduit for ironing out a dispute that cannot be resolved between the Commons and the Lords.
And Kathleen, we sort of spoke a little bit earlier about sort of, the 2024 Labour intake of MPs. I suppose there's been a criticism, I think it was brought up by Sarah Olney, the Liberal Democrat MP on Friday, that in this particular case, but maybe this is a sort of wider issue, politicians are acting more as activists than legislators. Do you think this sort of activism, is that a point that is you found yourself when you look at the type of lawmaking that's been going on in the country recently?
I mean, yes, obviously it's MPs mindlessly jumping on progressive-looking bandwagons without thinking through the consequences and not even caring to find out what the opposition thinks is a common feature of the political landscape. I think it's worth just stressing that something that perhaps we haven't said so far, and this presumably the Lords will have to tackle this. There is this bill is the only justification for it is potentially compassion. Autonomy, the arguments, like I just said, they won't get you there. It has to be, is it a compassionate thing to end someone's life by the administration of poison because they are suffering so greatly that there is no other alternative, right? So if that's the rationale, and I don't see how it can't be, because it's directed towards terminally ill people, and why are we randomly picking on them? Because we assume that they're suffering horrifically and we want to put an end to that suffering. Okay, so then you look at the actual format. Nobody has ever asked why they want to die. That is astonishing. If your intention is compassion, then of course you want to find out, is this person doing it because they can't get social care packages, because their relatives are just dropping heavy hints all the time, because they feel they don't know what else to do, or is it because they are suffering so badly that death is the only alternative? And do we know enough about palliative care? Most people don't know anything about palliative care. It's actually come on leaps and bounds in the last 30 years. The technologies are amazing, and we could easily make a political decision to invest in that. So that's the kind of detail that these MPs have just wandering into the Commons and saying, oh, it sounds nice and kind, and those people over there are a bit nasty. I mean, it's juvenile and depressing, but we just have to keep spelling out the consequences.
It's worth remembering that in committee stage, the MPs voted down an amendment to say, ask why. What is motivating? They voted down at report stage. I think it was over 260 MPs actively voted to say that you shouldn't exclude people if they want to end their lives because they are depressed or have a mental illness, because they are feeling suicidal, because they are in financial distress, because they are insecure housing, because they feel that they're a burden. They prioritized autonomy, and we heard from one of the backers of the bill to say, it's none of your business why I want to kill myself. So we have this detachment from the original argument, which is so often advanced about suffering, to actually saying, it doesn't matter. As long as you meet the criteria, the reason you want to end your life, this bill is agnostic on. This bill doesn't care.
Can I just add, it may be, what they're doing there is bringing in an old discourse about suicide itself, the permissibility of suicide. Is there a right for the state to intervene to try and stop me in my own project? And it used to be criminalized, so we can have a separate discussion about that. But, it may be, I don't even think it's true, but it may be none of your business why I want to die if I want to take my own life. But we are asking the NHS to do it. Then it very much becomes everybody else's business. It becomes those doctors' business, because if they are doing it for the wrong reasons, they would have done something profoundly immoral and potentially even illegal if coercion is secretly involved in a way that didn't come to light. They will be killing somebody or helping kill someone that could have gone on living and was dying for the wrong reasons. That's not a question about my business anymore. It's everybody's business.
It's a really interesting point. And, as you say, for all the reasons you've mentioned, it's been an incredibly controversial debate. I think on Friday, we did see some parliamentarians talking about the fact that it was Parliament at its best when some of these discussions were being had ahead of that vote. I mean, Nikki, I know that you yourself have had to deal with some quite personal attacks. I think there was some suggestions that you had been taking payment for putting across your opposition to the bill on Twitter. I mean, how would you respond to people who've suggested things like that?
The accusation there was from Paul Brand by direct message. So ITV's political editor decided to ask a question. This was after I had called out whether he was really impartial on the issue, given the balance of his content. I did run that through Grok and ChatGPT, and it spat out that it wasn't just my perception that there was a imbalance. So it was interesting that his question followed on from this particular exchange. And I was able to say, no, I am doing this entirely voluntarily. I've put on hold launching my business in order to do it because I saw a void and it needed to be addressed. I am the kind of person that, does wade in and doesn't, shut up, because I do think it's important. And I've seen too much legislation passed where there isn't enough thinking about what the consequences are. And that's and in this situation particularly, it really does require a level of responsibility and engagement of brain to think through what might happen. I am struck. So in terms of those accusations, I would say there's a lot of bad faith and a desire to dismiss the arguments. Kathleen has much experience with this, where it's sort of, don't look over there because it's been espoused by somebody. I would also just say it's not Parliament at its best where there are certain rules for discourse. Oh, you mustn't mention faith because then they all think this is it's a religious issue, or you mustn't say this because it will trigger the Labour MPs or something like that. So again, it's not Parliament at its best. It's sort of, think about the reaction to people using the word suicide and an inability to confront, the basic meaning of words. This is fairly poor. I would also say when you have an MP, a Labour MP, saying let's bookend the week after decriminalisation of abortion and the assisted, this is very superficial thinking which fails to recognise the consequences.
Yeah, I mean, so final question, I suppose, for both of you, actually. You've just mentioned the abortion there. As we've had the assisted dying bill passed through the Commons, but I think it was the week previously that MPs voted to decriminalise abortion. What do you see the future of healthcare in this country being on that note?
Oh, well, I mean, I felt very depressed after both votes. It's not, I mean, it's a bigger question than healthcare, really. It's about our attitude to freedom and whether we, freedom in inverted commas, because it's not clear it's any kind of freedom at all, but it's just like a meme at this point that's just kind of eating people's minds. And I have to be free. I can't even face the prospect of decriminalisation for aborting my own child at home using abortion pills. Because that's very stressful for me. So I must be free to do that, and the same sort of dynamic in the assisted dying bill, actually, so much is made of the potential of people who have participated in assisted suicide of their loved ones facing prosecution. In fact, Keir Starmer changed the rules in 2000 and whenever it was, so that hardly ever happens, and yet it's being presented as this terrible constraint on freedom. So people have become so obsessed with these things, middle-class people mostly, well-off people who are not going to suffer out of either of these initiatives. And we just don't seem to be able to see the bigger picture. And I think we're going down a very dark path indeed.
And Nikki, your take on that as well?
I think what we will see is that there will be further amendments, perhaps in this Parliament. We saw a strategy with both votes of knowing that there were the numbers to do something, and the idea that people will not try and bank further progress, in inverted commas, in this Parliament, I think is unlikely. So where you will start to see my concern, many concerns, but to the argument advanced that on abortion and decriminalisation for women, that it would protect women, I don't think that's the case. I think it will leave them very vulnerable, because it will be able to, anyone could turn around in an abusive situation or just in sheer pressure from family and say, go and get rid of that child, get rid of it. And the woman, knowing that she herself won't be a criminal offence, will go and do that alone, taking things she shouldn't take, and that is very dangerous. But so what I think will happen is, because that is going to be the consequence of this change that they are now pushing through, is that they will return and say, now look at these women dying or suffering extremely, let alone the impact on the child, the baby.
It is.
If I keep with their narrative, I'm going to stay there. But then they will push and say, here's an amendment to allow doctors to do it to full term. And listen, there will be further desires. And you can see that I think it was one of the campaign groups was saying, this is the road to full decriminalisation. This is a staging post to further gains. And that's where I think you will see it go. They will keep coming back, and they'll amend. You can do it through a number of bills, but you just add it on to the main bills that always have to be passed by a government.
If I can just quickly add in both cases of these discourses, you can see this, like, once you've conceded that something's a good thing, whether it is, or at least a permissible thing in the case of abortions at full term by their mothers, then you will get a slippery slope for many reasons. But one of them is that people will say, well, if it's okay there, then it's okay here. How can it be criminal to assist somebody in doing something? We've actually seen this in the assisted suicide debate. How can it be criminal to assist a woman in aborting when it's not criminal to abort? And that will be used, and we've seen exactly the same kind of dynamic in the assisted suicide, because it's like, well, if it's a good thing for this group to have it, why can't it be a good thing for this group to have it? And that's how you got the disabled without terminal diagnosis getting access to assisted suicide in Canada. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if there's attempts to widen the pool, because we basically will have conceded the principle, and then it's very hard to push back.
Yeah, it certainly supposes very concerning questions, I suppose, for the future of medicine. And as you say, there's wider questions there as well. But thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Nikki. And thank you for watching.